There was a moment in that courtroom when everyone watching thought they knew exactly how this story would end. The defendant sat there with a smile so calm, so unbothered, that even the prosecution team exchanged uncomfortable glances. But what nobody in that room understood yet, what wouldn't become clear until the final 7 words left the judge's lips, was that they were all watching the beginning of a psychological collapse that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about guilt, performance, and the human capacity for self-deception. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Type your country in the comments below. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear is one of the most emotionally devastating courtroom moments ever captured, and you won't want to miss a single case we cover on this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Now let's get into what really happened. The case began on a Tuesday morning in March, but to understand why that smile was so disturbing, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the version of this person that the world thought they knew. On the surface, the defendant was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd grown up with privilege, opportunity, and just enough charm to make people dismiss their worst impulses as quirks. Friends described them as magnetic. Family members used words like misunderstood, but underneath all of that, there was something else. Something that only revealed itself when the stakes were high enough and the audience was watching. The victim's family arrived at the courthouse before dawn. They didn't speak to reporters. They didn't make statements on the courthouse steps. They simply walked inside with the kind of heaviness that comes from knowing that no verdict, no sentence, no outcome could ever restore what had been taken from them. The mother wore the same necklace she'd worn to her daughter's funeral. The father carried a photograph in his jacket pocket that he would touch every time the defense attorney stood to speak. These details matter because, while the defendant smiled, these people were drowning. Jury selection had taken weeks. The defense team was meticulous, almost surgical in their approach. They weren't just looking for people who could be impartial. They were looking for people who could be swayed by a narrative, by a performance, by the idea that someone who looked this composed, this confident, couldn't possibly be guilty of something so brutal. And for a while, it seemed like their strategy was working. The defendant sat at the defense table every single day looking like someone who was inconvenienced, not terrified. They took notes. They whispered to their attorney. They adjusted their collar and sipped water with the casual ease of someone attending a business meeting, not a trial that could end with them spending the rest of their life behind bars. The prosecution opened with the facts, and the facts were ugly. This wasn't a case where the evidence was circumstantial or the timeline was murky. This was a case where the brutality was undeniable, where the premeditation was clear, where every piece of forensic evidence pointed in one direction, but the defense had something the prosecution didn't. They had a defendant who refused to break, who refused to show fear, who in fact seemed to be enjoying the attention. On day 3 of the trial, a forensic expert took the stand. She was calm, methodical, the kind of witness prosecutors dream about because she didn't exaggerate and she didn't speculate. She simply stated what the evidence showed: the blood spatter patterns, the angle of the wounds, the timeline of decomposition. As she spoke, the jury leaned forward. The courtroom went silent, except for her voice, and the defendant smiled, not a smirk, not a nervous twitch, a full, genuine smile, like they were watching a performance they found amusing. One of the jurors later admitted in an interview that they almost missed what the expert was saying because they were so disturbed by that reaction. But here's what makes that smile even more chilling. It wasn't random. It wasn't a nervous tick or a trauma response. It was strategic. The defense had coached their client extensively on courtroom demeanor. But what they hadn't anticipated was that the defendant would take it too far, that they would interpret confidence as invincibility. Psychologists who reviewed the courtroom footage later would point to that moment as a textbook example of narcissistic overconfidence. The belief that being perceived as unbothered would somehow translate to being perceived as innocent. The victim's best friend testified on day 6. She was 24 years old, and she cried through the entire testimony. She talked about the last conversation they'd had. She talked about the plans they'd made for the summer. She talked about how her friend had mentioned feeling uneasy around the defendant in the weeks before her death, how she'd said something felt off, how she'd been told she was overreacting. The defense attorney objected 4 times during that testimony, trying to keep out anything that spoke to the victim's state of mind. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the tears. They'd heard the tremor in her voice. And when the defense attorney sat down, the defendant leaned over and whispered something to their lawyer that made him close his eyes and shake his head. Evidence presentation took 2 weeks. Every day brought something new. Text messages that had been deleted but recovered. Financial records that showed a motive no one had expected. Security footage from 3 different locations that contradicted the defendant's alibi. And through it all, the defendant maintained that same eerie composure. They dressed well. They made eye contact. They never fidgeted. It was a performance, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But knowing something is a performance and being able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt are 2 very different things. The defense rested without calling the defendant to the stand. This was a calculated risk. On one hand, the defendant's calm demeanor had been an asset throughout the trial. On the other hand, putting them under cross-examination meant exposing them to a prosecutor who had been waiting for that opportunity since day one. The decision not to testify was announced on a Friday afternoon, and the collective disappointment in the courtroom was almost tangible. The victim's family wanted to hear the defendant speak. They wanted to see if that composure would crack under pressure. They never got that chance. Closing arguments began on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the trial started. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s who had spent 27 years putting violent offenders away, and she did not waste a single word. She walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece, building a timeline so airtight that even the most skeptical juror would struggle to find reasonable doubt. She spoke directly to the facts. She avoided dramatic flourishes. She let the evidence speak for itself. And then, in the final 3 minutes of her closing, she did something unexpected. She stopped talking about the defendant and started talking about the victim. She talked about who she was before she became a case number. She talked about the future that was stolen. She talked about the family that would never recover. And when she sat down, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. The defense attorney's closing was a masterclass in misdirection. He didn't deny the tragedy. He didn't minimize the loss. He simply argued that the prosecution had the wrong person. He pointed to gaps in the investigation that weren't really gaps, to alternative theories that didn't hold up under scrutiny, to the idea that rushing to judgment had led to a wrongful accusation. He spoke for 90 minutes, and by the end, he had planted just enough doubt in just enough minds that the outcome felt uncertain again. The defendant watched him with that same slight smile, nodding occasionally as if to say, "See, I told you." Jury deliberation took 4 days. 4 days of silence. 4 days of the victim's family sitting in the hallway outside the courtroom, waiting for a phone call that would tell them to come back. 4 days of the defendant maintaining their routine, eating lunch with their legal team, laughing at jokes, checking their phone during breaks as if this were all just an inconvenience. But on the 4th day, something changed. One of the court staff later mentioned that, when the call came in, that the jury had reached a verdict, the defendant's face went blank for just a second. Not afraid, not panicked, just blank, like a computer rebooting. The courtroom filled within 20 minutes. The victim's family sat in the front row on the left side. The defendant's family sat in the front row on the right side. The press section was standing room only. Every seat in the gallery was taken. The energy in that room was suffocating. Everyone knew that whatever happened in the next 10 minutes would define the rest of multiple lives. The judge entered and the bailiff called the room to order, and in that moment before the jury walked in, the defendant turned and looked directly at the victim's mother. They didn't say anything. They just looked, and she looked back with an expression that could only be described as exhausted grief. She later said that in that moment, she wasn't even hoping for a guilty verdict anymore. She was just hoping for it to be over. The jury filed in, and not one of them looked at the defendant. Court watchers know that this is often a sign, though not a guarantee. When a jury has voted to acquit, they tend to make eye contact with the defendant. When they've voted to convict, they avoid it. But even knowing this, even sensing which way the wind was blowing, the defendant's expression didn't change. The smile had faded into something more neutral, but there was still no fear. No recognition of what was coming, just that same unsettling calm. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The forewoman stood and said they had. The court clerk took the written verdict from her hands and walked it over to the judge, who reviewed it silently before handing it back. This part always feels like it takes forever. In reality, it's less than 30 seconds. But when your entire future is about to be read aloud in front of a room full of people, 30 seconds is an eternity. The defendant sat up a little straighter. Their attorney put a hand on their forearm, a gesture that might have been reassurance or restraint, and then the clerk began to read. In the case of the state versus the defendant, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant. There was a pause, not a long pause, maybe half a second. But in that half second, the defendant's face changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown. It was something quieter and somehow more devastating. It was the moment the performance ended, the moment the realization hit, the moment they understood that the confidence, the composure, the smile, none of it had mattered. None of it had saved them. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. The victim's mother made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The father squeezed his eyes shut and pressed the photograph in his pocket against his chest. The defendant didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, staring straight ahead at nothing. The clerk continued reading, confirming the verdict was unanimous, but no one was really listening anymore. The moment the word guilty left her lips, everything else became background noise. The defense attorney immediately stood and requested that the jury be polled, a standard procedure to confirm each juror's individual vote. One by one, 12 people stood and said the word guilty. 12 times the defendant heard it. 12 confirmations that there was no mistake, no miscommunication, no way out. By the time the 12th juror sat down, the defendant's hands were shaking, slightly but visibly, the first crack in the facade. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. She then turned to the defendant and explained what would happen next. Sentencing would be scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Until then, bail was revoked and the defendant would be remanded to custody. That's when it fully hit. The defendant turned to their attorney and said something that the court reporter couldn't hear, but that the attorney's face suggested was a desperate question. Something along the lines of, "What do we do now, or this can't be happening?" The attorney didn't have an answer. There was no answer. The performance was over, and the reality was just beginning. The bailiffs approached the defense table, and the defendant stood. Their legs were unsteady. One of the bailiffs had to put a hand on their elbow to guide them. As they were led toward the side door that would take them out of the courtroom and into custody, the defendant looked back one more time. Not at their family, not at their attorney, at the victim's family, and whatever they saw in those faces, relief, grief, rage, emptiness, it broke something. The defendant's face crumpled, not into tears, but into something worse, into the sudden, undeniable understanding that they had lost everything and there was no going back. The victim's mother later said in an interview that she didn't feel victorious when the verdict was read. She felt exhausted. She felt like she'd been carrying a boulder up a mountain for months and had finally been allowed to set it down. But her arms were so tired that she didn't know what to do with them now. Her husband said he felt numb. The best friend who had testified said she felt like she could finally breathe for the first time since the trial started, but also like the air didn't taste right anymore, like something fundamental had shifted and would never shift back. The media coverage exploded within minutes. News outlets that had been covering the trial began running the verdict as breaking news. The courtroom footage of the defendant's reaction was played on loop. Legal analysts dissected every moment, every expression, every implication. Social media erupted with opinions, hot takes, and debates about justice, about privilege, about the psychology of someone who could smile through their own murder trial. But none of those conversations captured what it felt like to be in that room when the word guilty was spoken. None of them captured the weight of that silence, the finality of that moment, the way the defendant's entire future collapsed into a single syllable. Sentencing day came 6 weeks later. The courtroom was just as packed, but the energy was different. There was no suspense this time. The verdict was in. This was just about how severe the consequences would be. The victim's family was allowed to give impact statements, and they did. The mother spoke for 12 minutes about what had been stolen from her. Not just her daughter, but every future moment she would never get to have. Every birthday, every holiday, every phone call, every hug. She talked about how she still set a place for her daughter at the table on Thanksgiving because her brain couldn't accept that she wasn't coming home. She talked about how her marriage had nearly fallen apart under the weight of the grief. She talked about how she would never ever forgive the person who did this. The father spoke for 7 minutes. He was quieter, more measured, but the pain in his voice was devastating. He talked about how he used to be able to sleep through the night, and now he woke up every few hours checking his phone, expecting a call that would never come. He talked about how he'd sold his daughter's car because seeing it in the driveway every morning was unbearable. He talked about how he didn't believe in the death penalty before this, but now he wasn't sure what he believed in anymore. The best friend spoke last. She talked about survival guilt. She talked about how she'd replayed their last conversation 1,000 times, wondering if there was something she could have said or done differently. She talked about how she dropped out of school because she couldn't focus, how she'd lost friends because she couldn't talk about anything else, how this case had consumed her entire life and she didn't know who she was without it anymore. And then she looked directly at the defendant and said, "You took everything from us and you smiled. I hope you remember that smile for the rest of your life, because we will." The defendant was given the opportunity to speak. Their attorney had advised against it, but they insisted. They stood and faced the victim's family, and for a moment it seemed like they might apologize. But instead, they offered something else. They said they understood the pain they'd caused. They said they wished they could take it back. They said they were sorry, but the words felt hollow, scripted, like something they'd rehearsed but didn't fully believe. The victim's mother shook her head slowly the entire time they spoke. When they sat down, she leaned over to her husband and whispered something. He nodded. Later, she would tell reporters that what she'd said was, "That wasn't an apology, that was a performance." The judge delivered the sentence without hesitation. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under the law. She explained her reasoning in clinical terms: the brutality of the crime, the lack of remorse, the calculated nature of the actions. But then, in the final minute of her statement, her tone shifted. She looked directly at the defendant and said something that would be quoted in every news article written about the case. She said, "You came into this courtroom believing that confidence could substitute for innocence. You were wrong. The jury saw through you. This court sees through you, and history will see through you. You will spend the rest of your life reconciling with the person you chose to become." The defendant was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs for the second and final time. This time, there was no composure, no performance, just a visible, undeniable collapse. Their shoulders were hunched, their head was down, the smile was gone, and it would never come back. As the door closed behind them, the victim's mother finally allowed herself to cry, not quietly, fully, loudly. Her husband held her, and they sat there in the front row long after everyone else had left, just holding each other in the space where their daughter's killer had finally, irreversibly, been held accountable. In the days and weeks that followed, more details emerged about the defendant's life before the crime, patterns of manipulation, instances of cruelty that people had dismissed or explained away, relationships that had ended badly and left others feeling used, confused, or frightened. Psychologists who reviewed the case noted that the defendant displayed classic markers of antisocial personality disorder: superficial charm, lack of empathy, inflated self-worth, pathological lying. But none of that mattered to the victim's family. They didn't need a diagnosis to understand what had been done to them. They just needed the person responsible to be held accountable. And finally, after months of waiting and wondering and watching that smile, they got that. The defendant's appeals process began almost immediately, as it does in every case of this magnitude. The defense team argued that the jury had been prejudiced by pretrial publicity, that certain evidence should have been excluded, that the sentence was excessive. Every single appeal was denied. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. And the defendant remains in prison to this day, serving that life sentence in a facility where smiling doesn't earn you anything except suspicion from the other inmates and indifference from the guards. There's a psychological concept called duping delight, the thrill that some people feel when they believe they're successfully deceiving others. It manifests as smirking, smiling, a kind of giddy superiority. Experts who study criminal behavior point to that smile in the courtroom as a textbook example. The defendant genuinely believed they were smarter than everyone else in that room. They believed that maintaining composure was the same as maintaining innocence. They believed that if they just performed confidence long enough and convincingly enough, the jury would doubt the evidence. They were wrong, and the moment they realized they were wrong is the moment that smile died. The victim's family has since started a foundation in their daughter's name. It provides support and resources to other families navigating the criminal justice system after losing a loved one to violence. The mother gives talks at law schools and victim advocacy conferences about what it's really like to sit through a trial, to watch your child's killer smile at you from across the room, to wait for justice and wonder if it will ever come. She says she does it because she doesn't want her daughter's death to be meaningless, doesn't want it to just be a case file or a news story that people forget. She wants it to mean something. She wants it to help someone. The father has become more private. He rarely gives interviews and he doesn't attend many of the foundation events. He's still processing, still grieving, still trying to figure out how to live in a world where his daughter doesn't exist. He's in therapy. He's on medication. He's doing the work, as he puts it. But he also says that some days the weight of it is so crushing that he doesn't get out of bed until noon, and some days he forgets what his daughter's voice sounded like. And those are the days that feel like dying all over again. The best friend eventually went back to school. She changed her major to psychology with a focus on trauma. She says she wants to understand what happened, not just to her friend, but to herself, to all of them. She wants to understand how people become capable of such violence, how survivors cope with the aftermath, how justice works and when it doesn't. She's writing her thesis on the psychological impact of courtroom testimony on secondary victims, drawing heavily from her own experience. She says the trial broke her, but it also gave her purpose. She doesn't know if that's a fair trade, but it's the one she got. As for the defendant, reports from inside the prison suggest they've struggled to adjust. Inmates who commit violent crimes against women are often targeted, and the defendant is no exception. They've been moved between facilities multiple times for their own safety. They've spent months in solitary confinement. They've filed grievances about mistreatment, about conditions, about their rights. But none of it has changed the fundamental reality. They will never leave prison. They will never have another moment of freedom. The confidence, the composure, the smile, all of it was a mask. And when the mask was ripped away, there was nothing underneath but a person who destroyed lives and then had their own destroyed in return. There are court watchers and true crime enthusiasts who still go back and watch the footage from that trial. They study the defendant's face, looking for the moment the facade cracks. They debate in forums and comment sections about whether the smile was genuine arrogance or a defense mechanism. They create timelines and psychological profiles and theories. But none of them were in that courtroom when the verdict was read. None of them felt the air change when the word guilty was spoken. None of them saw the way the victim's mother's face shifted from exhausted hope to exhausted relief. None of them heard the sound the defendant made when the bailiffs put the handcuffs on. A small, choked noise that might have been a sob or might have been the last gasp of their former self disappearing forever. This case has been cited in legal journals, taught in law school classes, referenced in documentaries about narcissistic criminals. It's become a case study in how not to behave in court, how overconfidence can backfire spectacularly, how juries are more perceptive than defendants often give them credit for. But more than that, it's become a story about consequences, about the moment when someone who believed they were untouchable realized they weren't, about the moment when performance stopped being enough, about the moment when justice, slow and imperfect and painful as it is, finally arrived. The victim's mother says she thinks about that smile sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. She wonders if the defendant ever thinks about it too. If they lie awake in their cell at night and remember the way they looked at the jury, at the judge, at her, if they regret the arrogance, if they understand now what they couldn't understand then, that you can't smile your way out of the truth, you can't perform your way out of accountability, you can't pretend your way out of the consequences of your own actions. And maybe that's the real lesson of this case. Not that justice is always served, because it isn't. Not that the system is perfect, because it's not. But that there are moments, rare, precious, devastating moments, when the mask falls, when the performance ends, when the person who thought they could get away with anything realizes they can't. That courtroom was one of those moments. That verdict was one of those moments. That smile disappearing was one of those moments. The victim's family still visits her grave every Sunday. They bring flowers. They tell her about their week. They tell her that the person who took her away is in prison and will never get out. They don't know if she can hear them. They don't know if it matters. But they do it anyway, because it's the only way they know how to hold on to her, and holding on is all they have left. The mother says that sometimes she imagines her daughter is proud of them for seeing it through, for sitting through every day of that trial, for not breaking when the defendant smiled at them. She says she hopes that wherever her daughter is, she knows that justice was done. Imperfect, incomplete, and far too late, but done nonetheless. There's a moment in the courtroom footage that you can watch over and over and still catch something new each time. It's right after the verdict is read, right after the word guilty echoes through the room. The defendant turns slightly to the left, just enough that the camera catches their profile. And in that split second, before they compose themselves again, before they remember they're being watched, there's an expression on their face that's almost childlike in its helplessness. It's not fear, exactly. It's not sadness. It's the expression of someone who just realized that all the rules they thought they understood, all the control they thought they had, was an illusion. And illusions, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. The judge from the case has since retired. In an interview given 5 years after the verdict, she was asked if she remembered that trial. She said she remembered every trial where the defendant showed no remorse, but that this one stood out because of the smile. She said it was one of the most unsettling things she'd witnessed in 40 years on the bench. Not because it was unusual for defendants to maintain composure, but because this defendant seemed to be enjoying it. She said that when she delivered the sentence, she made sure to look the defendant in the eye, to make sure they understood that their performance had failed, that the jury had seen through them, that the law had caught up with them. She said it was important that they knew that. In the end, this isn't just a story about a trial or a verdict or a smile that disappeared. It's a story about the human capacity for self-deception, about the moment when reality refuses to be denied any longer, about the families left behind to pick up pieces that will never fit back together the same way. It's about the fact that justice, when it comes, doesn't heal. It doesn't restore. It doesn't bring anyone back. All it does is draw a line and say, this far and no further. This person will be held accountable. This will not go unanswered. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all justice can ever be. Not healing, not restoration, but accountability. A line in the sand, a verdict read aloud, a smile that dies when the word guilty is spoken and never, ever comes back. Right now, I need you to do something. Go down to the comments and type your country. I want to see where all of you are watching from. And I want to build a community of people who care about these stories, who understand that behind every case is a human being whose life was stolen and a family that will never be the same. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're going to keep covering cases like this, stories that need to be told, verdicts that need to be remembered, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like this remind us that justice, however slow and imperfect, still matters. I'll see you in the next one.